Clovice is a professional cellist and composer who composed his first symphony at the age of 17 and was a professor of computer music at UC Santa Barbara from 1978 to 1986. He has also been a serial entrepreneur and software designer for the past 30 years. In addition to music and technology, he has a lifelong passion for aviation and has been a private pilot since 1987. Clovice intends to become a UU minister with an emphasis in breaking down racial, class, and ethnic barriers and in preaching the gospel of the madness of human self-extinction. He shares with us today his hard-hitting observations of the last 4 years in Through the Dark Woods, the Gift of Temptation. And now let us welcome Clovice Lewis.
Thank you, Carol. This was a very difficult sermon to write when I started it 3 weeks ago, because I had to account for 5 cases that could have possibly happened this morning. Biden's victory is uncontested. Trump's re-election is uncontested. The election results are still unknown. The election results are contested. And 5, Trump is trashing the government on his way out. Of course, there are some standard ministerial things to say at a moment like this. A good minister would remind everyone that feelings can be hurt when you gloat. There are always 2 sides to any story. I might say something like, compromise means no one is too badly damaged because everyone loses a little bit for the common good. And something like, this is a time for healing wounds of divisiveness and rancor and to come together as an American family. Consider that I've just done the good ministerial thing. Now that's over, let's get to some hard truths. I'll first talk about issues that need to be addressed, no matter what our political landscape looks like at the moment. And then I'll discuss the spiritual aspects of the circumstances we find ourselves in. And finally, I'll talk about how we can go forward as people of faith in a world that's been upended. James Burke wrote a book in 1985 called The Day the Universe Changed. In the book, Burke describes how seemingly small random events or isolated moments can radically change our understanding of ourselves and the world around us. In the introduction, Burke wrote, "We are what we know. And when the body of knowledge changes, so do we." I believe such a moment occurred on July 27th, 2016. And that moment happened just after the Republican National Convention had concluded and Trump had been nominated as president. My wife Carol and I watched an interview with former Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, and CNN's Allison Camerata. And we were horrified to hear Gingrich explain what we now all understand as alternative truth. When confronted with the facts by the reporter that crime in the United States had actually decreased, he insisted that facts don't matter as much as feelings about crime. He said, "The current view is that liberals have a whole set of statistics which theoretically might be true about crime, but it's not where human beings are. People are frightened. As a political candidate, I'll go with how people feel, and I'll let you go with the theoreticians." I believe that was the moment, the warning shot, that very few of us heard about the death of truth and the political weaponization of fear. That was the moment when temptation overtook our nation and we succumbed to fear. We ran willingly into the dark woods. Our nation has been fatally tested in the past 4 years by the temptation of comfortable false narratives about the exceptionalism that denies our true past and obscures our present. We accepted a president who operates from his basest instincts and feelings. The once grand old party actually became, for the first time in our existence, a party that embodied the ego of one man and reflected that fact in their national platform. It was a platform of violated human rights, celebration of white supremacy, and disregard for the health and well-being of the planet and all the creatures on it. Democracies run on fact, science, and objectivity, along with rules and laws. When there is no basis for action save feelings, there's no democracy. And we all knew that, but we abandoned our best path because a messy democracy became too complicated to bear. And Newt Gingrich and his ilk smashed our Achilles heel to herd us into temptation and usher in an era of darkness. Now I'm going to cut to the chase. I'm not going to mince words with this congregation. I will tell you why I think we found ourselves in these dark woods. It is because people of color are locked into a death spiral with white America because, let's be honest, white America is afraid of losing its identity and its historical privilege. There's solid research to suggest that this fear runs extremely deep, that it runs deep enough to tear our nation apart. And we've seen this. The research shows that much of the extreme hardening of political ideology on the right is a function of racism. For example, political scientists Stephen Miller and Nicholas Davis of Texas A&M released a study in 2016 entitled White Outgroup Intolerance and Declining Support for American Democracy. Their study found a correlation between white America's intolerance and support for authoritarian rule. In other words, when intolerant white people fear democracy may benefit marginalized people, they abandon their commitment to democracy. And study after study confirms this in what social scientists now call the Trump effect of rising authoritarianism. We drank the Kool-Aid, and now we're suffering from the sugar high. Our myth of American exceptionalism, which I've talked about before, has made us believe that the history of the United States is inherently different from that of other nations. We believe in a unique mission to transform the world, and that this mission gives us a superiority over other nations. So we abandoned commitments to lessen the effects of climate disruption with other countries. We shredded human rights guarantees for refugees and immigrants. I mean, I thought my heart was going to break, and I just kept crying every time I saw little children in cages as a policy. We sided with murderous dictators for the sake of expediency. And earlier roots of this kind of thinking brought us to the doctrine of manifest destiny that allowed us to commit genocide and embrace slavery. But unlike the South Africans who faced their past with truth and reconciliation commissions, we've just gone blithely along without cleansing ourselves. Now, this level of racism so woven into our national DNA, with that level, we have been blinded to the moral forest for the trees. The myth of American exceptionalism was the siren song of Trump. Its melody was hatred and its lyrics were lies. Our seduction to its temptation took us on a spiraling circle to the basement of our weakened and now crumbling democracy. It was flown on the wings of greed, xenophobia, racial and ethnic animus, homophobia, sexism, intolerance, religious cowardice, and hatred of the other. We feasted on lies, cruelty, indifference, and supremacy. We were lost. We are lost. Now, this was the moment when I was writing this sermon that I felt that I had to determine which way to go. Are we still lost today? Is Trump still our president? Did Biden win a landslide that overwhelmed any attempt at cheating? Are we still protesting racial brutality of police in the streets? Have our tears of anger and grief turned into tears of joy? No matter who was elected, we still need to live in a country with millions of people who are angry and upset. Some take the results of this election as a call to arms, both figuratively and literally. Many millions are angry the election was rigged, and they fear for the end of their world. From a spiritual perspective, the answers to these questions of what happened are not as important as what caused those questions to be raised. My point is that this is not a crisis of merely political or economic or medical or legal proportions. This is a spiritual crisis of worldwide proportions. In this world of binary choices, we get lost. What is absent from this forest we're in is grace, forbearance, patience, kindness, compassion, and love. Those are the lights at the periphery of our view that cannot be focused on at the moment. We have lost our way, and we feel alone in our isolation. We sprinted into the dark forest because we were afraid. We're here in that forest because we've forgotten we are not alone. We have succumbed to those feelings of isolation and fear for the past 4 years. Now, the danger is to ignore further temptation. So forget judicial literalism, differences between capitalism and socialism, deficit spending, globalism, military spending, economic disparities, the trade deficit, homelessness, the pandemic, and a host of other problems. I believe the greatest challenge we have is to bring social justice into the center of our national ethos. And that is the place from which all the other issues we must face can best be addressed. So here's the hit playlist of social justice, the 9 most pressing challenges that encompass the rest: racial injustice, voting rights, climate justice, healthcare, the refugee crisis, the income gap, gun violence, and hunger and food insecurity. And you notice that none of those issues were positively addressed by the previous Trump administration. In fact, most of them weren't even mentioned. This playlist used to be called things like forming a more perfect union or for the greater good. These were covered under the modern concept of social contracts, which we all understand intuitively as the basis for civilization. So the idea that we cannot lift our heads up towards a brighter purpose is just another of the great lies of trickle-down capitalist hegemony. We actually have the ability to form a more perfect union and address all of the social justice issues. So here's some facts. I know Newt Gingrich might not like this, and you might have a problem with these pesky little things, but here they are, nonetheless. About $175 billion is what it would take to bring every person in the United States up to the poverty line. That is just 1.08% of the nation's gross domestic product. That number is just about 1/5 of the $671 billion the federal government will spend on the military. And here's another fun fact. The $200 billion to pay for the initial batch of F-35 fighter jets, which are chronically plagued with misfortunes and incompetence, and which is just one weapon system program in the United States defense budget, that could have housed every one of the 554,000 homeless people in the United States in a $300,000 house last year. So don't believe we do not have the wherewithal to do everything necessary to dramatically improve the quality of life for every American citizen by placing social justice at the core of all of our legal, economic, and policy imperatives. These last 4 years have revealed the terrible reality that our country is fractured along many lines and that our cherished values were never intended for all to enjoy. The last 4 years have revealed that we may not have the moral and political will to pay more than lip service to social justice. And all that said, there is something to the notion of the spiritual will of a people. We saw it in our nation during the Civil War. We also saw it during World Wars I and II, and during the 9/11 crisis. We know the United States is capable of lifting its head to the sky. We are capable of escaping the dark woods. And no, the way out is not always straight or even noble. We interred Japanese Americans during World War II. We have suppressed voting rights for decades, and as we can see, we're still at it. We've segregated our fellow citizens, and we are still discriminating against people because of their race, ethnicities, or gender identities. We have done terrible things during our time in the woods, and even now, on our slow way out, we're still being tempted. The Japanese art of kintsugi is based on the concept that embracing flaws and imperfections, you can create an even stronger, more beautiful piece of art. So broken pottery is mended in the areas of breakage with lacquer mixed with powdered gold or silver or platinum. And the binding becomes part of the aesthetic quality of the pottery. The binding also makes the entire structure stronger. And I believe our country can become stronger and more beautiful by the intentional examination of our flawed past and how that past has influenced the present. The ideals most of us share, but have somehow forgotten how to communicate to each other, can be the precious metals that binds all of the fractured parts of our nation. So I have a suggestion. Let's just start by telling the truth again. And then we can mix in caring for the health and well-being of others, and then stir in some respect for the opinions and feelings of our neighbors, and then go so far as adding a generous dash of love for our planet and each other. That's what we should glue all the broken parts of our country with. we are a rich and vibrant nation because at our core, we embody beautiful concepts. Our ideals have inspired the world because of their spiritual and moral brilliance. We've proven that we can endure the despots, the racist administrations, and government by insults because we are a good and decent people. We've earned a reprieve, I think, by electing Biden and Harris, thank God. But we still have a long way to go. We can't sit still. But through all this, we've learned we are stronger than the temptations that seek to divide us. We need to get out of the dark woods, but we are Americans. I've said this before. So I'm going to borrow words from some pretty awesome people on an airplane. Let's roll.